Good morning. Welcome. If we could switch the presentation, please. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Quickly, I'd like to present the most important legal issues and the legal basis, the legal framework related to CPPAs in Poland. So generally speaking, at the moment in Poland we don't have any legislation regulating such agreements. In Europe, they were entered by the RED II directive in 2017. The directive indicated the general provisions and conditions of buying renewable energy, indicating the possibility of the direct purchase of energy from generators by off-takers, and the EU legislator obligated the member states to verify any possible legal and administrative barriers in their own legislation and ordered the removal of such barriers by the member states so as to disseminate the concept of long-term PPAs as much as possible. The time for the implementation, or the deadline, passed in 2021 at the end of June, but in February 2022, 1.5 months ago, in the list of legislative work, there appeared a draft act on amending the RES Act, which is supposed to implement the definition of PPAs into the Polish legal system. Despite the lack of the implementation and such a definition, on the Polish market already a dozen or so CPPAs were concluded. You all very well know that this happened. One of the largest agreements were entered into by Orange, CNC. Recently, a large agreement was the one by T-Mobile for a capacity of close to 100 megawatts. So the market so far has been doing quite well without any specific legislation. However, the legislator decided that it's high time to implement the requirements of the directive. Therefore, they are debating the act on amending the RES Act, which defines PPA. It's a type of a contract of selling electricity from renewable energy sources. It might happen based on distribution and transmission services contract. So apart from selling, the source will be connected to the national grid, and based on the distribution and transmission services provision contract, they will be implementing provisional. The sale of electricity can happen based on private wire. And this addition of the private wire option is very important here from the point of view of the market, because it opens up the new opportunities to have more such generating sources. Now, talking about the barriers to development, which make it difficult for the market to develop. Now, first of all, we don't have enough sources. That's the main pain here, the lack of sources that you can use for the long term and the limited number of PV sources that can be contracted based on CPPAs. Now, talking about wind sources, they have already won CFDs within the auction-based system. They are covered by the support scheme, and the will of leaving the support scheme at the moment is not very high. Now, if we talk about PV, the demand for such projects, or the supply, of such projects with a large installed capacity is significantly lower at the moment. So if you want to buy electricity, you don't really have much choice. Another issue we've been facing is the issue of receiving so-called connection conditions. This is mainly the issue for developers, which directly translates into the size of the projects that can be used by off-takers. And the final issue, something we all heard about, but only few of us have seen it, the private wire, that could be the right solution for many off-takers, especially in energy-intensive industries. So the ability of building your own source and directly connecting it to your own facility. Unfortunately, at the moment, despite the fact that the provisions on the private wire are within the energy law, current market conditions and regulations practically make it impossible to use in practice, because the possibility of using a private wire requires a direct agreement by the president of ERO, and this agreement requires that a number of preconditions are met. That's why we haven't seen any private wire facilities so far. I wouldn't really call it a barrier, but it's like a hurdle or an issue we need to deal with on the young Polish market. It's the lack of certain standards. We don't have enough agreements for all the market players to know what and how they want to buy. At the same time, companies offering the sale of electricity based on PPAs have not developed precise products to quickly and easily enter into such a transaction, because everyone, both the off-takers and generators and trading companies, are just learning. They are working on these products, really. As we speak, the only product that's always available that the generator wants to offer is the base produce without base load. Pay as produce. So as much as you generate, you sell. So pay as produce. But the off-takers expect at least to have a base load produce or other products. Well, but they are not available at the moment. Therefore, there's a lot of room for development on the side of generators to provide a broader portfolio of products and to offer them to off-takers. And the issue of financing is yet another issue, which is a bit broader. It's multifaceted. The approach of banks to financing CPPAs with entities that don't have financial ratings. Well, so far this approach has been very cautious. We don't really have ready-made, on-the-shelf financial products to finance these projects. This is always done on a case-by-case basis. You have to establish these conditions. On the other hand, we don't have products that would secure both parties, both the generator and the off-taker. The generator in such a way that the off-taker could easily receive a guarantee of payment that could be presented to the generator, and the other way around, that would ensure that to the off-taker that when the generator does not provide electricity, this guarantee should cover the damages to a certain extent. Now, how can we remove these barriers? How can we facilitate this? How can we precipitate the development of the market? Well, first of all, the first hurdle related to the supply of sources, like the speakers before me mentioned during the first panel, we need to remove the 10H barrier related to wind projects. So buying this type of assets at the moment is practically impossible because their availability in the market is minuscule. Now, talking about PV projects, it's difficult to get connection conditions because we don't have enough connection capacities, and the solution will be, first of all, making it possible to use the private wire solution. This will be related to the implementation of the 944/2019 directive. The proposal of implementing the directive in the Polish legal system is being debated as we speak. In the list of legislative works, it's UC 74, sorry. It amends the energy law, among other acts, in the scope related to regulating the private wire, or the so-called direct line in the EU speak. And the new definition of a private wire implements exceptions from the need of receiving consent of the president of ERO for the construction of such a private wire. And they are as follows. You don't need to have an agreement to build a private wire that will supply in electricity only the own facility. However, the own facility of the off-taker, or the limit of installed capacity pursuant to the draft was 2 megawatts. After consultation, after the first round of consultation, because the first round of consultation has taken place already, the ERO took the position that the limit should be 2 megawatts. The ministry veers towards having an installed capacity limit of 5 megawatts. Unfortunately, in none of these cases could it revolutionize the situation on the market. Well, the directive does not limit us as far as the installed capacity is concerned at all, if you were to use a private wire. But the Polish legislator is a bit cautious, is afraid of the impact on the grid as a result of opening up the private wire option, and the fact that some of the energy-intensive off-takers would be interested in limiting their energy use from the grid towards the use of a private wire. Hence the idea of implementing some limitations. However, both 2 and 5 megawatts from the point of view of the market is not enough. It's too low. It seems that 20 megawatts at least could be a satisfactory solution both for off-takers and would not cause significant issues on the grid side.
Another exception from getting to have the regulator's consent is to build a private wire to an off-taker who is not connected to the grid. So we're talking about, so to speak, island system. And also, we could build, or there could be a private wire to a final off-taker from a renewable installation with installed capacity lower than 1 megawatt. So up to 1 megawatt, no problem, you can build. When it comes to larger installed capacities, right now there is a discussion going on. Right now there are talks around the limit and what it might be. Another solution that could help us lead to a larger number of projects out there is the cable pooling, the idea of cable pooling. So infrastructure can be shared between different wind farms or between different PV farms. Thanks to the cable pooling solution, one connection can actually serve both or two projects, a wind project and a PV project. Why? Because wind projects mostly generate energy during the night or towards the evening, or mostly autumn, winter, early spring, while PV projects and PV farms mostly generate in the morning, somewhere before noon, and starting from spring through the end of the fall. So this is where they generate more. And during the other periods and time frames, they produce less. So thanks to this, and the fact that we already have existing resources and assets, then we can generate additional projects that will not be too problematic from the point of view of the grid connection, and they will not be generating additional cost thanks to cable pooling. So they will not affect tariffs. When it comes to dedicated financial products, it seems that a good solution would be to introduce some standards. If banks introduce some standards, some dedicated, ready-made solutions for projects that would, for example, be based on long-term CPPAs. On the other hand, it could be interesting, at least from my point of view, and maybe you could support such solutions, or maybe the state could support such solutions. So the Polish Development Fund could, for example, make it easier for off-takers and generators to have their obligations and liabilities guaranteed. Another issue is that of standardization. So maybe some solutions could be introduced, some standards could be introduced, even some standard clauses or some standard text of CPPA that would make it easier for smaller operators, for smaller companies to sign CPPAs. Because right now, CPPAs are, so to speak, well, they require collaboration of the generator and the off-taker with additional experts, companies, people who would support both parties. And I think that to a degree, at least, all those processes surrounding CPPAs could be really simplified, especially if we have dedicated ready-made products. And then even smaller players will have an easier time concluding such CPPA agreements. Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for this introduction and giving us an overview of existing legislation, where we are, and what our regulatory framework is. And right now, I would like to announce another panel discussion. So I'm inviting here Tomasz Kopka, Senior Consultant at the Polish Agency for Trade and Investment, the PAIH Investment Center, Maciej Kowalski, Managing Director of Enefit, Maciej Krzyczkowski, Communication Leader, IKEA Industry, Sweden, Mr. Piotr Listwoń, Vice President of the Towarowa Giełda Energii, Jacek Misiejuk, CEO at Enel Poland, and Vice President, COO of CMC Poland, Wojciech Więcławik. Ladies and gentlemen, as you may know, a regulatory framework is there for a reason, and we need to talk about it. Why do we need to talk about legislation? Well, when we talk about renewable sources, when we talk about how they develop, we need to talk about megatrends, because this is the reason why companies are even interested in green energy sources. Definitely reducing carbon footprint. This is something that's becoming more and more a factor in decisions made by corporate players. When they decide to invest, they are ready to invest in reducing their carbon footprint. So my question goes to Mr. Kopka, senior consultant at the Polish Agency for Trade and Investment. What do international investors that come to you expect? What are they thinking of, and what factors do they take into account? Thank you for this question. Definitely investors are very often held accountable by their shareholders. They are very often limited by their international policies. And very often these policies dictate that they need to use renewable energy sources in their generation processes. So when they come to us, they often stress how important it is for them to have a project that can be fed by renewables. And we're trying to help them as much as we can when they come to us. And indeed, I think there is a certain bottom-up pressure. It's not only shareholders that put this pressure on investors, but also customers, consumers, regulators as well. There is a new taxonomy and there is a new framework for sustainable financing. So right now it's clearly defined what kind of financing can be considered sustainable. Of course, financing can be cheaper, can be attractive, more attractive for sustainable projects or projects that are renewables based. They can enjoy cheaper financing. So definitely all these things, all these factors come into play. Pressure from shareholders, pressure from clients and customers, as well as financial institutions and their demands before they grant financing. So investors, for international investors, when they come to Poland, especially energy-intensive businesses, when electricity costs are a big part of their costs, they want to have, of course, energy at an affordable price, lower costs, so that they don't have to buy, for example, certificates or credits. Right. This is important, especially that here in Poland, well, together with Estonia, we are unfortunately on the top of the list, of the notorious list of top polluters. So definitely, lots of companies want to invest in Poland, but they would like to have access to green energy. So let me ask you about companies who are already present in Poland and how things have changed and how relations changed between business partners, financial institutions, and this mega trend, the green energy mega trend. Does it have any influence on the economy and how competitive it is? This question goes to Wojciech Więcławik, Vice President, COO at CMC Poland. So please give us the perspective of an energy-intensive sector, looking at costs. Well, this industry, well, the metal smelting industry, it has two technologies. One technology is, of course, blast furnaces, steel, coking coal, and so on and so on. But there's another furnace technology where you can use scrap instead of ore. So in our case, we have electrical furnaces, and we use scrap, but we use 800 gigawatt of energy annually. But right now, over 30% of our energy is renewable. From a perspective of a big client, right now the situation is better than it used to be, even a few years ago. Several years ago, we already started sort of getting into PPAs. We've become interested in PPAs. The first PPA as an industrial off-taker we signed in 2019, and starting from 2021, we have a financial PPA, and we use 25%. 25% of our consumption is based on this. And the reasons are exactly as you mentioned. First of all, there is a certain pressure coming from our customers and clients, because our clients, well, they use steel for construction, and they want to have green steel, or at least clean steel. And well, I talked about different technologies, electric furnaces versus blast furnaces. There are differences in levels of emissions. Because if we're talking about electric furnaces, well, carbon footprint has been reduced to minimum. There's little we can do to further reduce emissions, but it's much less. It produces much less emissions than blast furnaces. In a country like ours, where we are so much based on coal, there are some indirect emissions that we actually give to the environment. They are much higher than our direct emissions coming from furnaces. So we really have to take care of the other element, namely indirect emissions that we sort of contribute to. But we started doing our work, we did our homework way, way back, expecting what's going to come. So as I said, we signed the financial PPA a few years ago, and I think that today we've already announced, or we will soon announce, another statement about the PPA for physical supplies of power supplies. I will not get ahead into any announcements that might be published in the media soon, and we are in very advanced talks with another PPA for 150 megawatts, and I think still in this year we will negotiate, and we hopefully will have signed two another PPAs. So pressure coming from our customers, pressure from our investors. We are a listed company, listed at the New York Stock Exchange, so definitely there are a lot of expectations around sustainability over there. And of course, we cannot do nothing. And of course, there is a certain financial pressure, given how much carbon and CO2 costs, given what's going on out there. Simply, the clean solution is better. It's not as cheap as it could have been if we did it a few years back, but still, it's simply much better doing PPAs compared to using power from traditional plants. Right, so that's a good example of how watching megatrends, following megatrends, and acting on megatrends can help Polish companies be competitive, be well-positioned, and contribute to the strength of this particular economy, which is really, really relevant for the steel sector. The steel sector being absolutely key for many other industries. So I would like to ask a similar question to Mr. Maciej Krzyczkowski of IKEA, representing IKEA's headquarters. Can you tell us, from your perspective as a global company who is present all over the world, and I think in all of our homes, at least, your company is represented. We know very well what your company offers. But tell us a little bit more about your supply chain. I know that IKEA is one of the leaders in terms of supply chain innovation. You are a trailblazer in terms of supply chain management, so tell us. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. To me, taking part in a traditional offline conference is a treat after a lingering pandemic. After saying thank you, let me just say it's a pity that all of us panelists are men. I know it's because there were some changes made at the last moment to this panel, to the composition of this panel, but I want to stress that we should seek diversity not only in our energy mix, but also in terms of gender and genders represented in our panels. I know that Resource Poland is an organization that's backed by women, and among its co-founders there are women, which is great. I represent IKEA, and what I know about our approach to clean energy is something that I've learned from my female colleagues at the company. So now I'm here to tell you about it. I represent IKEA Industry. IKEA Industry are IKEA-owned plants. We have 18 our own plants in Poland, 18 locations, and this is what IKEA Industry is all about. Plus, we have a number of external suppliers apart from our own plants, and they actually produce for us, and then at the end we put an IKEA Made in Poland sticker on it. But anyway, Poland is a big part of IKEA's supply chain. 20% of our global production comes from Poland. And when it comes to wooden furniture, nearly 50% of our global production. Like, as I said, wooden furniture. So, indeed, Poland is an important market, plays an important role in our supply chain. And let me tell you why we try to become cleaner in terms of energy. Definitely shareholder pressure, true, but I feel that IKEA is also one of the makers of this pressure. Are we feeling this pressure? Sure, but we're also making it. There's a lot of pressure coming from employees as well. IKEA Industry employees also expect that. They want to be working for a sustainable company. They want to be working for a company that promotes sustainable development, and they are happy to be working for a company who has a people, planet, positive strategy in place. We are very ambitious in terms of climate protection. We want to become a brand that's climate positive, and we want to become this by 2030. So really, really soon. So 2030, IKEA as a brand wants to be a climate positive brand. So when we talk about IKEA as a brand, we also mean our entire supply chain. Therefore, Poland is so important for us, being such a big part of our supply chain. Not taking into account the Polish energy mix, we would not be able to achieve our climate positivity goal. So that's the pressure. We are making this pressure. We are putting this pressure on our suppliers as well. We want to transform, and we want to invest in clean, green energy, but we tell that to our suppliers as well. So we have invested in PV, in wind. Globally, the Inca Group, which is the retail arm of IKEA, invested 2.5 billion euro in renewables. And today in our portfolio, we have nearly 1.7 gigawatts of renewable energy sources, including in Poland. We have IKEA Retail owns 80 wind turbines across 6 farms. So this is like 180 megawatts of installed capacity. Nearly 1 billion zlotys. This is what we've invested. And we started these investments in 2011. And the turbines have been there since 2016. And this is our own energy, our own turbines. And this is what we do. And we want to keep on investing because this is what we need. This is what we want. And our global corporate structures announced last year that they would allocate additional 4 billion euro towards investing in renewables. So 2.5 billion I already talked about. Inca Group invested it, and now our corporate structures do that.
So now it's the time we don't know where they will invest this. And me, as a representative of IKEA and a person working in Poland, I'll be pleased to see at least a part of this investment project completed in Poland. Now, for this, we need everything we've been talking about so far, and we'll continue talking: transparency, a clear direction of energy transition, and regulations supporting the investment process. I think that's the most important thing. So these are our own plans, 4 billion euro, our own plan of IKEA Group. But we are saying this to all the members of our supply chain, without whom we won't be able to achieve our ambitious goals. So I'm sure there's a lot of untapped potential there. We don't really know how they will switch to the green side of the force. However, there is a huge untapped potential there. We're talking about pressure and incentives as well. So there's a carrot and a stick. So I think this will be a real incentive. IKEA, for sure, is not the only large corporation with such plans for the environment. So I'm sure that the accumulated value of these investment projects could be really high. Let's hope they will also find their way to Poland. So you have specific expectations, but also tangible funds earmarked for investment. Unfortunately, with the highest emission levels, well, we need to do something about this. Otherwise, these funds will not be spent in Poland. So I would like to ask the panelists who represent the energy or utility sector, the companies that took the challenge, that rose up to the challenge and want to offer green electricity to off-takers and are able to show how to do this, how to deal with energy transition. We don't live in a void, so it's worth sharing some experience of companies operating not only in Poland, but also in our part of Europe. That's why about this experience I'd like to ask Maciej Kowalski, the Managing Director of Enefit in Poland. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The whole Europe has been dealing with energy transition, and our legal systems are not adjusted to these changes. So this is a work in progress. In Poland, there are some legacy issues related to legislation that generate some barriers. In the case of these large projects, large entities are dealing somehow with that. However, the most efficient investment projects and areas are behind the meter. So what we saw in the presentation, the opening presentation of our panel, so they are the most efficient because they are the easiest to complete. They facilitate the use of resources of off-takers, rooftops, some industrial zones, other such locations. But if I look at the number of exclusions prepared by the legislators, like a ready-made slide for removing the barriers, we'll talk about at the next conference in a few years' time. So we have a private wire that's been operating for 10 years now. I mean, the system at least, but not a single installation has been built in Poland so far. But I do hope that step by step we'll put our foot in the door. It hasn't been an issue in many countries. They've managed to sort out the whole legal framework, the PPAs behind the meter. So just quickly, we need to have a legalized metering, so distribution companies should do that in Poland, and some type of supervision of like some kind of regulatory authorities over the grid and the TSOs over the technical side. Another area that's been more and more popular. At the end, I will list these typical CPPAs, are so-called utility PPAs. So when the customer doesn't have the credit worthiness to complete the investment by themselves or with a partner, because not everybody is in the position of IKEA, like your supply chain member or your supplier. So you need to have the right market conditions that would allow the trading companies, or so-called utilities, to use a more traditional word, to provide long-term stable electricity to off-takers. We know that Polish legislation is quite complex, to say the least. There's a huge number of obligations for a single megawatt hour, and it's not really grounded in many cases. We shouldn't really have all these complexities there. So simplicity is key here, both on the side of typical market-based supply is very important. Now, going towards the large corporate PPAs, the largest, we've had a few in Poland. It's not like that that's it, that we've solved it all. I think that the president of Towarowa Giełda Energii Stock Exchange will say more about this. There are some credit solutions that have to be guaranteed or secured by the state to provide simple market benchmarks. If there's a market price benchmark in the form of an index or loan guarantees, in Scandinavia it's been functioning quite well. There are corporate PPAs for 23 or 26 years even of tenure for the financial perspective. So this package of solutions necessary to implement this is quite broad-reaching and multifaceted, and has to be adjusted to every industry. It's very important what you said. We need to look at the development of the market and the development of RES from a practical side. This is true both for the legislative framework. We should not talk about hypothetical situation, about ifs. We should talk about the here and now, and should be quickly implemented, especially in the current state of affairs, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and providing energy security, largely based on RES, and having an energy transition towards the zero emissions economy. So it's very important, as you're stressing, due to the need of building the competitiveness of our economy, of your sectors, of your companies, but also keeping Poland attractive. So that's a practical dimension here. I'd like to ask about this. How is it with RES? It's not only about to have as many as possible in the system, but to efficiently use them. So please share your experience. I'd like to ask President of Enel X, Jacek, and tell us what it's like from in the context of energy, efficient energy use, like demand-side response mechanism. We know that Enefit is a leader here. So just quickly, give us some practical tips. Good morning. Now, talking about the recent situation that has changed a lot on the energy market, you can see that we need to precipitate our switch to the green electricity. There's a huge crisis on the fuel market, very high prices. It's impossible to import gas. It causes certain issues. In the introductory presentation, you've covered this. You mentioned the main issue with connections. We, as the group, are a world leader in the number of renewable energy sources. It's close to 50 gigawatts of installed capacity, and we are one of the largest transmission and distribution companies, 71 million users. So we know some issues related to connecting to the grid. So maybe for this reason, in 2017, Enel invested into Enel Opt company that was the global supplier of demand-side response services. Demand-side response is about balancing the demand by periodical reduction of supply, or so the supply by the demand. So in the type of critical deficit of capacity, the demand can be lowered. Such services are used only in special cases. In the Polish system, recently we've had quickly developing PV, close to 9 gigawatts, many energy sources. When there's a lot of sun, we don't have a strong wind. When there's a strong wind, there's not always a lot of sun. There's some support from the cogeneration sources that help in some cold winter evenings and nights. But during critical conditions on the energy market, when we have very high temperatures, there is no wind and there is no sun, we have deficits of power supply. We've seen in recent years that there is this trend, there's a growing trend, the number of hours where the maximum demand exists is smaller. So on the one hand, there's a very high peak. After removing renewable energy sources, there is nothing to replace it. And there's the potential for the off-takers who want to make money on supporting the electricity grid. Almost 10% of demand is the potential of up to 100 hours a year, and PSE needs additional reserves. So in fact, we have more reserves, but we already in Poland have been functioning on the capacity market. Close to 300 companies are our customers, 500 megawatts worth. So that's quite a sizable potential. But we see that these needs will be growing quickly. Currently, the variable demand is over 3,000 megawatts. In 3 hours, that's over 5,000 megawatts. Coal, in a sense, so can extend the 200 unit life. It can fill this gap, but it's not really so. If we assume that close to 25 such power plants, so-called 200 units, have an extended lifetime by 10 or 5 years, it will be costly. But considering the switch from the cold state after modernization is quite high, as the high minimum level to a hot state gives us only 25 power plants over 3,000 megawatts. So that's what the variability already is within an hour. So we don't have flexible sources. If we will start building them, they will be expensive. A good solution could be natural gas, but we all know what happened. It may be difficult to secure supplies of natural gas. We do have connections or interconnections to other systems, but we do not have enough contracts to cover this supply. So with the growth of demand on natural gas, this could be an issue as well. So one of the solutions that will allow us to start up a larger number of renewable energy sources is the greater activity of off-takers. As the current program is quite attractive for off-takers. A few hundred companies have already took it on board. We are testing it, so we soon have more than 50 tests, successful tests for PSE. So we are showing that off-takers can reduce their demand should there be such a need. However, the reform of the energy market was supposed to implement the commodity market has not been completed from the demand side response point of view. We are lacking a component that would allow us the off-takers to make money not only in a critical situation when there are no market reserves, the strategic reserves like the capacity market. Apart from the test, it hasn't been activated even once because it's a strategic reserve. Only once all the market available assets are exhausted. But after the new stages of reform, off-takers should also be able to operate on the market on their own volition. That would allow them to start up reserves quicker than in the case of the capacity market. It will allow them to make money in such situations when the electricity is expensive, when there's not enough of it on the market. This will give a further incentive to flatten the curve of the demand net curve and to start up new sources. And the existing sources could be operate in a more stable manner, more efficiently. We've gathered a lot of experience in this. We've been operating in 15 countries and 50 operators. In many countries, the cause of implementing demand response services was not like in Poland, that we didn't have enough strategic long-term assets, but the fact that more and more of these renewable sources have been entering the system. This is one of the solutions, allowing the flexibility, quick flexibility reserve, the spot market and the balancing services, allowing the off-takers to make money and to reduce their costs. So we have quite a few such examples in Europe and Ireland. Currently, they're able to operate with a 75% share of so-called asynchronous or volatile sources, mainly renewable. By the end of the decade, it should have been 50%, even though they don't have a lot of flexibility reserves. But there is a huge share of DSE in these services, allowing that. The other example is Germany, opening up the flexibility market not only to large baseload power plants that's been functioning in Poland so far, but also to distributed sources to off-takers. Well, as a result, despite a huge development of renewable energy sources, the balancing cost dropped. So this was a double whammy for the off-takers. They could make money and they could also pay less for electricity, for clean electricity, and more of it to boot, and to increase their energy security. So these are some examples only, but I could list many of them for a long time. Obviously, we don't have time for that. So to sum up, I think these examples may make us optimistic about the future. Once these mechanisms are implemented, it will be easier to connect renewable energy sources, and operators will worry less what to do if this variable net supply will be so high that coal-based sources will not able to manage that. Thank you. So these are examples worth debating and following, because the energy market has been changing, and the market we knew 5 or 10 years ago is completely different from the one today. And the market of the future will probably be different than the one we knew so far. So experience from other countries is extremely valuable, and it's best to learn on some other people's mistakes than your own. Now, talking about the evolution of the market, the key role is played by Towarowa Giełda Energii, or Electricity Stock Exchange. I'd like to ask the president of the company, how does he see the development of renewable energy sources in Poland in the future, especially based on corporate PPAs? What can you as a company offer to the market and to the off-takers? So good morning. First, I'd like to point your attention to a certain symbol. I have not planned it. I'm one of the last to speak in the first round of questions, but I sit in the center. So I had a chance to listen to the left and to the right side, to listen to all the voices, to listen to the solutions, to the expectations, and like to refer to the fact that this is our role, the power exchange. I wouldn't like to be negative about it. It's positive. So this is our role, to have a positive impact. We listen to both sides of the market, we listen to the expectations of the market, and we're trying to utilize our tools, the mechanism we can offer to facilitate the market and its development. Undoubtedly, energy transition towards renewable energy sources is something we see the market should follow, and the role of our company and all the products should be adjusted to the shape of the market and what it should look like and its expectations. Another speaker mentioned some products that are being analyzed or developed. Yes, it's true. As a company, as an exchange, we work with a team of experts for various purposes. At Towarowa we have a team of experts on the development of RES and exchange products for the RES sector. And there is a whole list of proposals which will be developed further in the pipeline. Some that are simpler, some are more complex, while some other require a longer debate, because it's not easy, all of it. We're talking about things that are quite difficult.
As much as renewables and, well, producing energy from renewables is quite simple, but all the mechanisms that are going to support and assist and foster the entire value chain are not so simple. I talked to someone right before we started this panel, and we talked about indices that were strictly dedicated to PV and to wind on our power exchange, and we actually announced it some time ago. And it's, well, we commissioned the Jagiellonian University with coming up with such indices, namely the ones that I mentioned, PV and wind. We are right now just finishing our work. The team of researchers and analysts, as well as financial institutions like KUKE, which is the Polish export credit insurance company, and all the other ones, well, they're helping us to verify and validate our initial assumptions, whether it's all doable, whether it's all feasible, and whether it all makes sense. So again, I would like to say thank you to everyone, all our associates, everyone who are experts and say, for example, yes, this is a good idea, or sometimes no, you can modify it. So we're going to introduce these indices in our power exchange. First, it will be just an indication, but maybe it will be used for future spot contracts, for example, or maybe it will be just for the market participants' information. What else are we working on at the Polish Power Exchange? You mentioned PPAs and CPPAs and similar agreements. Before this panel started, there was a presentation by my colleague, and he talked about barriers and what needs to be done for us to be able to overcome these barriers. And he mentioned standardization, he mentioned security, and he mentioned the right financial instruments. And these were the three key points related to also the issue of private wires. To us, well, we need to create an alternative, or we're thinking of creating an alternative to PPAs. We're thinking about such a platform that could offer a standardized product, some financial instruments, for example. We know that, well, we're here, we're communicating. We're not just working in isolation. We try to listen to you and your voice, ladies and gentlemen. I know that there are many, many kinds of PPAs, like financial PPAs, utility PPAs, CPPAs, and so on and so on. And all those PPAs have their specific conditions embedded in them. So it's very difficult to standardize a product. I went to a conference at one point, and one of the speakers said that PPAs are just like electricity sockets. In every single country, those sockets are a little bit different. And the prongs and the holes are, placed in a little bit of a different place, and so on and so on. It all depends on specific conditions in a specific country. So again, PPAs are in a way the same, right? Because it's really important, like, for example, how far your plant is from the generator, for example. For us, it's important to come up with a certain standardized instrument or a standard that would interest and appeal as many participants of the market as possible. And then our power exchange can really work and can help smooth entering and terminating of contracts. It's an alternative to today's PPAs, because today a PPA is a contract between two entities. And if we offer our standard, it will be more of a multilateral relation or a contract, but you don't know whom exactly you're entering into an agreement with. So, for example, an off-taker can hedge, secure supplies of energy, they can secure prices into the future, and they can be sure that they're going to get the power, because actually this is what the Polish power exchange is all about. But on the other hand, the manufacturer, the generator, also secures their price, and they know that they're going to get the money. We collaborate with our own clearing house, who's also making sure that all this happens. It's very important. Also, from the point of view of funding and financial institutions, we talked about banks who are in the mix, and banks are also trying to create as safe conditions that are as safe as possible for them if they choose to finance a project. So yes, working with us, with our platform and with a standardized product could be a good idea for banks. But we know that companies that are in renewables, they could be huge corporations, multinationals, or they could be mid-sized companies. And for mid-sized companies, we have to come up with a different form of sort of security mechanisms, something more agile, something lighter. So we work with a number of companies and advisors, trying to make sure that, it all fits the size of the company. Of course, financial instruments are subject to indexation, and prices change, right? Every day there is a different price. And if you think about 5, 10 years, you don't know what's going to happen. So definitely a clearing house, for example, if it's supposed to guarantee financial clearing and delivery of the actual product, well, we have to have all the right mechanisms. And we have to introduce security mechanisms that are acceptable by mid-sized companies. They cannot be too heavy on them. It's very difficult. It's one of the more difficult things that we're facing, actually. You talked about PFR, the Polish Development Fund, that it could be a guarantor, for example, and guarantee certain contracts and certain performance of certain obligations for smaller companies or mid-sized companies. So again, we're looking on new instruments, something more standardized, something that will help a wide range of companies feel more secure. It could be good to secure the price, could be good to secure your delivery, and it could be good to secure things for financial companies. So this is what the Polish power exchange could do for everyone. Right. I think we all are in agreement, and we can tell immediately how we can reach consensus in this whole process of energy transformation in Poland. But for a discussion to be vivid, I need some controversy. So I want you to look very critically at the presentation that was that introduced this panel. Do you think that this is the right picture, the right image of barriers, regulatory barriers, or maybe they are different altogether? If you could give us brief comments. I think we're over time, so be critical, but be brief as well. and tell us what needs to change in current regulations and what needs to change urgently. I think we haven't managed to talk about it yet, but many investors are talking about oversizing as a problem. PV is really talking about oversizing quite a lot as a problem. So the renewable sector, especially in PV, it's able to generate, let's say, 100%. Or it can, but the operators are limited or restricted based on how they are connected. And actually, generators would love to be able to connect more of their generation, to connect more PV panels. And they would be happy to always produce up to 100%. Well, you're talking about obstacles, regulatory barriers. I will not talk about the obvious, like turbines. Well, IKEA has stopped investing in turbines. The ones that we bought in 2011 started operating 2016. Now we're not investing in that. We've invested in some turbines in Romania some time ago, but now not anymore. In Poland, we're investing in PV, and not just for so-called prosumers. We offer that to our clients, but actually for our own plants, for our own facilities, we also invest in PV. And bureaucracy, red tape, is a huge problem. And red tape, of course, is a result of regulations. Let me give you a specific example. IKEA Industry Zbąszynek, one of our largest plants, one of the largest furniture plants in the world, I would say, 3,500 employees over there in Western Poland. And in that particular plant, we wanted to invest thousands of PV panels, nearly 20 megawatt. That was what we wanted. That was what we were preparing for. And we've been trying to do that for nearly 2 years, and we haven't even started the project. Fortunately, we now already have all the required permits and licenses, and on the 21st of May, we will officially start the project. But actually, the regulation says that it takes 180 days to get a formal decision. And we even had a situation where after 180 days, we didn't get a consent. We got remarks that we had to clear. And actually, those remarks maybe could have been sent to us after 10 days rather than after 180 days. And we had to modify and change things and then send it again and then wait again. For example, let me talk about PV installations on roofs of retail stores. I used to be in the retail industry. For example, zoning plans and regulations on urban planning and zoning plans treat PV as something much more serious than AC boxes. But actually, AC boxes on roofs are taller, more bulky than PV panels. But anyway, if PV panels are, if there's more required from PV panels, then again, red tape is growing. Now some regulations have changed, but actually local governments have a hard time interpreting the new regulations, and so on and so on. So I know these things are tough. I know these things are complex. And I feel that, again, the changes that we want may not be the most important changes or the biggest things, but we would like to, eliminate some of the red tape because we're here. We're ready to invest. We're ready to spend money instead of, having to wait. All right, so let me repeat what I said before. One thing is building price benchmarks. We need space, like the power exchange, a place, a platform where you'll be able to see prices, where you'll be able to see different contract features and spot and so on and so on. And, well, the European Union, the impending climate crisis really are forcing us to transform our energy sector. So it would be good to have something like the power exchange working the way we want it to work. And, of course, we need a big change in approaches to extending and developing our grid. Because, well, there are right now some legal frameworks, some financial frameworks that require some changes, and we need to invest in the grid more than just to maintain it. And then people will start fearing private wires, for example. And then we will just be able to focus on what we need to do, namely supply the power, supply the energy. When we look at this as the Polish power exchange and brokers that work with us, because brokers very often help companies who are manufacturers, generators of renewable energy, we see that there could be a problem. Hopefully the problem is not going to materialize, but we can see it looming on the horizon. So there are operators, or there are companies that generate renewable energy. They have all the right permits, they have the concession, they have the license, and if they are to be present on our power exchange, they can sell power. But actually, their operation is based on the weather, sun, wind, and so on. So if such a company is supposed to start trading through a broker, for example, or to trade, if they are supposed to trade on the power exchange, they have to be able to balance. Because what happens if there is no wind on a given day? So they need to have some balancing capabilities. And to me, it's natural, and hopefully the Energy Regulation Office will see it soon, that as they grant licenses for generation, they should also allow some purchases so that companies can balance, just like that. Not for trading purposes, simply for balancing purposes. They should be able to purchase something. Plus, well, so I think the regulator has to take care of it. But it is a regulatory barrier, and maybe it will not be such a barrier after all. When it comes to a quick pace of development of renewables, if renewables are to develop quickly, we need to make the system more flexible. Not all off-takers really feel like it will pay off. Sometimes they treat this as a last resort before a complete blackout, but a lot of off-takers have a huge potential, and they need flexibility. The International Energy Agency estimates that around 500 gigawatts could activate within the next 10 years, sort of as a flexibility. And what we're missing, what we're lacking, are regulations that will allow us to act on this flexibility, to really introduce this flexibility. Our industrial off-takers usually buy that energy and consume it at a stable level. And providers are quite used to this. But, for example, the package of clean energy for all Europeans, this package was supposed to incentivize off-takers to be more flexible, maybe even resell power, resell energy, even without having to get consent from the supplier, from the generator, so that the customer, the client, is the owner of the power, and maybe they could sell it on. Then, being part of such a scheme would be much more attractive, and it will actually answer some of, if not all, some of our challenges, some of our problems. Like, for example, very high cost of supplying the capacity that right now may be missing. Definitely the Polish PSE, the operator, the Polish grid operator, should also open new balancing capabilities, because we have some artificial barriers, some artificial obstacles. Aggregation is really limited. Plus, there was a mechanism that was supposed to make it easy for off-takers to get, for example, spot contracts and participate in spot markets. It's still not there, even though technically it's possible, and it's very limited. But it could be something very helpful, something very useful for us. And actually, EU directives that are out there indicate that very clearly, and we're obliged to implement these directives. So I think this is something very, very important. And of course, energy storage and power storage. This is something that should be with off-takers. Could be timber, could be steel, could be whatever. Simply, it would be cheaper for them to store energy this way. But there should be some energy storage capabilities for regulatory purposes. But it should all happen on the off-taker side, so that our grid is not overloaded. So this should solve many of our problems, many of the problems that the grid operator is dealing with. Maybe that's why the grid operator is not allocating different capacities that they could have allocated to wind farms. So yes, regulation that regulates power storage at off-takers should be introduced, because it's much more efficient to do that on the off-taker side rather than on the generator side.
I'll state the obvious. As an industrial off-taker, 10H is absolutely something I need to get rid of as soon as possible. The largest demand, the more efficiently can we satisfy this huge demand. The private wire, this holy grail you mentioned in the presentation before the panel, that's a key component for large industrial off-takers who have the potential of cooperating with a partner and building something that will be directly connected to their grid. Now, about the distance, it's about the bottom line. So we think it has to be close, right next to the facility, but I think it can be a few or a dozen or so kilometers away. So it's about the bottom line. Is it urbanized or not? And the energy prices will decide. So the directive you mentioned, implementing some exclusions in the ERO's approval of the private wire. So these are laughable levels, really. Sorry to be blunt, but a company using a few hundred megawatts, well, having a 2 or 5 megawatts for a private wire without a license, well, it doesn't make it interesting at all for anyone. I understand that, but this private wire could require a permit, but this permit should be very clearly described. The criteria, what you have to do, what parameters you have to set to receive this permit. We won't be really begging to build anything without a permit. There should be clear criteria on how to build this. We're talking about the absolute values. 5 or 10 megawatts. For somebody, it's a lot. For somebody, it's not enough. Why shouldn't we think about a percentage of the ordered capacity as at a level of use for which the private wire would be satisfactory for the off-taker and it wouldn't generate a lot of hassle in the local distribution network or the transmission network. So these are two obvious points. One another which is not that obvious, balancing generator versus off-taker. So as I said, we have been debating actively with many people here in the room. We're talking about PPAs. We always hear that the standard is the as-produced profile. We insist that the standard on the market is base load, not the as-produced profile, because we don't want to buy as-produced. It's inefficient to us. So the solutions supporting renewable energy generators and efficient balancing, obviously this will come at a cost, we are aware of that, are necessary. And this will be much cheaper than the cost of purchasing as produced for a large off-taker who actually needs to focus on their own processes and have as much energy as they wish, not to deal with balancing. So I would say these 3 points are the most important. Apologies if I could just refer to something that you have just said. I don't know why we need a decision of the ERO for the private water. I think the provision is there for him not to issue it. If it's a large factory, it's licensed anyway. It has to be connected anyway. So anyway, that's a part of the infrastructure which is under supervision of the ERO. So, well, we have created a system of permits that's an obstacle, really. The simplest way would be to remove this part of red tape we don't need for anything. So that's a very specific recommendation. I think we will follow this. As Resource Poland, we will actively participate in making sure to remove all these obstacles and barriers. Thank you very much for your input, for an interesting debate. Unfortunately, our time is up. We have actually exceeded the time allowed for this panel. So, to sum up, I would just like to say that, first of all, as people responsible for running Resource Poland, we accept all the guidelines you mentioned, or tips that you mentioned, or recommendations you mentioned, that as a set of things to do as research, we will be active champions of unlocking the potential of RES, because it's impossible to use this potential of corporate PPAs without untapping this potential. If we don't unlock the supply side, we know that the demand is growing, that this train will not stop, it will go even faster. Now, to conclude, I'd like to refer to the plan of the PSI that has recently been consulted, which indicates that we have room for over 50% of RES in our grid in the next 10 years. And I'm confident that provided all these barriers are quickly removed, and if all the aids are implemented in the legal system, we will enjoy the completion of this ambition plan even faster than the PSA predicts. That's the logic of the transition as the scale of challenges, not only in Poland but across the world, in our part of Europe. So once again, I'd like to thank all the panelists. So it's a pity that we were not joined by female panelists. I do hope that in the future debates we have a more gender equal setup. So this is also important for the organization I'm representing. So thank you again. I encourage you to participate in future debates, and let's have a 5-minute break. So I wish you all the best. Thanks.